I thought I'd be lonely after my husband died, but the truth is, I had already been lonely for years, while he was still right there beside me. My name is Margaret. I'm 66 years old, and until recently, I was a wife. For 42 years, I shared a house with a man named George. People used to say we were a model couple, quiet, respectable, dependable. They thought that meant we were happy. But what they saw and what I lived were two very different things. I met George when I was 22. Back then, I thought I needed someone who could ground me, someone steady, someone who knew what he wanted. George was all of those things. He was calm, composed, well-dressed, the kind of man who made decisions without hesitation. He liked things tidy, predictable, contained, and he liked me that way too. At first I didn't notice it. The little corrections, the small dismissals, the way he always seemed to know better. When I laughed too loud, he'd touch my arm gently and say, "Not so loud, Maggie. It's unbecoming." If I cried during a sad movie, he'd hand me a tissue, not with comfort, but with embarrassment. I stopped laughing loudly. I stopped crying in front of him. When we went out, I wore what he liked: muted colors, soft fabrics, never anything attention-seeking. I remember once wearing a bright yellow scarf my sister had given me. He looked at me and said, "You're not trying to be young again, are you?" I never wore it again. Over time, I learned to shrink myself, to make myself small, agreeable, invisible. We never had children. His decision. "Too messy, too loud, too expensive," he said. I told myself I was okay with it, that maybe it wasn't meant to be. But sometimes I would watch mothers in the park, pushing strollers or wiping sticky hands, and my chest would ache with something I couldn't name. Our home was always quiet, spotless, organized, but it was the kind of quiet that doesn't bring peace. It was the silence of walking on eggshells, of holding your breath, of forgetting the sound of your own voice. George didn't believe in therapy. He thought emotions were private matters. I once tried to tell him I was feeling low, like I was disappearing inside myself. He frowned and said, "You've got everything you need, Margaret. Don't be ungrateful." That word, ungrateful. It stuck to my skin like dust I couldn't wash off. So I stopped talking, stopped asking, stopped needing. When George died last spring, heart attack, they said, I sat on the edge of our bed and stared at the wall. Not a tear in my eyes, just silence. That same familiar silence, but now it had a different weight. People brought casseroles, cards, condolences. They touched my hand and said, "You must miss him terribly." I nodded, of course. What else could I say? That I missed the idea of being loved? That I missed who I used to be before I became this shadow of a woman? No one asked me if I felt free, but I did. In the quiet after his passing, I started to hear my own thoughts again, and they scared me, not because they were dark, but because they were honest. For the first time in decades, I was alone, but not invisible, not small, just me. I started going through the house slowly, room by room, drawer by drawer, not to clean or organize, but to see what was actually mine. What had I chosen? What had I loved? It shocked me how little there was. The furniture, the decor, even the cutlery. It was all George. His taste, his rules, his order. I'd lived there for over 4 decades and barely recognized anything as a reflection of me. In the back of the closet, I found a box I hadn't seen in years. Inside, a stack of letters from my sister, now long gone. The handwriting felt like a voice I hadn't heard in forever. She used to tell me I was the brave one, the dreamer. "Don't let the world shrink you, Maggie," she'd written once. "Promise me you'll stay bright." I didn't. I forgot how. I sat on the floor with that box in my lap and cried, not because I was sad, but because someone had once seen me before I vanished behind George's shadow. Someone had loved the real me. In the days that followed, I started doing little things I hadn't done in years. I played music in the kitchen, music I liked. I left dishes in the sink overnight without guilt. I bought a ridiculous purple robe just because it made me laugh. And then, one morning, I did something that felt almost revolutionary. I cooked breakfast the way I wanted it. Eggs over easy, toast with too much butter, coffee strong enough to wake the dead. George used to insist on oatmeal and tea, no salt, no sugar. Heart health, he'd say, as if joy had to be rationed. I sat at the table in my purple robe, crumbs on my plate, coffee in hand, and I whispered to myself, "This is mine." The silence in the house began to change too. It didn't echo anymore. It settled. It breathed. It began to feel like peace instead of punishment. I started writing again, just in a notebook at first. Thoughts, fragments, questions. I didn't know what I was looking for, only that I needed to speak to myself again. I had spent so long being careful, agreeable, forgettable. I wanted to remember what it felt like to want something. One afternoon, I stood in front of the mirror and really looked at myself. Gray hair, tired eyes, skin that sagged in places I used to worry about, but also strength, survival, stillness, a quiet kind of beauty I never allowed myself to believe in. I didn't feel young, but I felt awake. It was strange after so many years to be in a house that no longer had to be quiet, to be in a life that no longer had to be small. I wasn't sure what I was becoming yet, but I knew I wasn't done becoming, not anymore. Some days I stayed in my robe until noon and just sat by the window. I watched the street like it was a show made just for me. Kids on bicycles, neighbors walking dogs, couples arguing softly, laughing loudly, living without apology. I used to watch life happen through that window while George was alive too, but back then I wasn't really watching. I was comparing, judging, wishing. Now I was simply noticing. I started waving at the mailman. He was surprised the first time. I guess I wasn't known for being friendly. George always said, "No need to get too involved with people." And I believed him. Or maybe I just obeyed him. But now I craved even the smallest acknowledgement, the tiniest thread of connection. One afternoon, a girl selling cookies rang the doorbell. Normally, I would have pretended not to hear it, but this time, I opened the door. She couldn't have been more than 10. Curly hair, missing tooth, freckles dancing across her nose. "Would you like to buy some cookies?" she asked. I hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Sure, what's your favorite?" "Thin mints," she said proudly. "Then I'll take 2 boxes." She beamed and handed me the order sheet. I stood there, pen in hand, realizing I hadn't written my name in weeks. When I handed it back, she looked up and said, "You have a nice smile." I closed the door and cried. Not because I was sad, but because I had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as something soft, something kind, something alive. Later that day, I opened the drawer beside my bed and found an old pair of earrings I hadn't worn since my 40s. Little silver hoops, nothing fancy. George said they made me look cheap. I'd buried them behind years of things I didn't care about. I put them on and stared at my reflection. For the first time in a long while, I looked interesting. Not beautiful, not young, but interesting. Like a woman with stories, like someone who had things to say. That night I poured myself a glass of wine, red, the kind he hated, and sat outside on the porch. The air was crisp, the stars scattered like little secrets waiting to be told. I closed my eyes and breathed in the night. No one asked me where I was going. No one told me to come inside. No one reminded me of the rules. I was free. Not loud, fireworks kind of free, but quietly, delicately, the way the tide slips back into the sea. For so long, I thought the house had been my cage, but I was wrong. It was never about the walls or the locks. It was about forgetting that I had the key all along. There's a strange kind of grief that follows freedom. It isn't loud, it doesn't scream, it doesn't make a scene. It settles in quietly, like dust on a shelf you haven't touched in years. It shows up in moments you don't expect, like while folding laundry or staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m., wondering who you are without the person who made you feel invisible. That's what happened to me. One morning, just a few weeks after George's funeral, I was making coffee. Strong, black, just the way I like it. I'd gone years without drinking it the way I preferred because he said it upset my stomach, and I believed him. Or rather, I didn't have the strength to disagree. But that morning, I stood barefoot in my kitchen, watching the coffee drip into the pot, and I realized I could do whatever I wanted now. The radio was playing softly in the background. A song came on, one I hadn't heard in years, Neil Young's Harvest Moon. I stopped mid-step. I remembered it immediately. George hated that song, said it was too soft, too sentimental, too much like you. But I used to love it. I'd play it in secret when he wasn't home, dancing quietly in the kitchen, imagining a life where I could be light, where I could be soft without being ridiculed. I'd forgotten how that felt, forgotten what it meant to sway freely, to smile just because I could. So, in that moment, with the smell of coffee in the air and the morning light slipping through the windows, I let the song play. And I danced. Not well, not gracefully. My hips were stiff, and my feet were unsure. But it wasn't about being perfect. It was about moving, about reclaiming the space that had once felt like a prison. I danced, and then I cried. Hard, messy, noisy. The kind of crying I had never allowed myself to do while George was alive. Because I wasn't crying for him, I was crying for me, for the girl I used to be, for the woman I'd become, for the years I'd spent playing small, staying quiet, shrinking myself to fit inside a life that never truly felt like mine. After the tears came stillness, a strange, comforting stillness. I sat down at the kitchen table, wrapped my hands around the warm mug, and whispered, "You're free now." But what do you do with freedom when you've forgotten how to use it? Later that day, I went rummaging through the hallway closet. At the very top was an old box I hadn't opened in over 20 years. Inside were journals, dozens of them, spiral-bound, leather-bound, some falling apart at the seams. They were mine, from before George, before I disappeared. I opened one carefully. The handwriting was younger, looser. The pages were filled with poems, lists, dreams, fears, arguments with myself. I read entry after entry, feeling like I was meeting someone I used to love but hadn't seen in a long time. There was one page that stopped me cold. It said, "One day I'll live in a house filled with light and books and laughter. One day I'll love someone who lets me speak. One day I'll be brave." I couldn't stop staring at those words. I whispered them out loud. One day. Well, that day had come. And though the laughter still felt far away, and my voice still trembled when I used it, I was here, in a house that was finally mine, with light coming through the windows, with books on the shelves, and no one to tell me to be quiet. That evening, I sat on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket, and watched the sun go down. It was something I never used to do. George always had the TV on, always wanted dinner at a certain time. But now, I listened to the birds, the wind in the trees, the creak of the old porch swing. And for once I didn't feel lonely. I felt still. And then, just as the last bit of light slipped away, I whispered something I hadn't dared say out loud in years. My name is Margaret. I'm 61 years old, and I am still here. It felt like a beginning, like a quiet revolution inside my chest, and I promised myself I was going to find her again, the woman who dreamed, who danced, who wrote in journals and believed in one day. I didn't know exactly how or where to start, but I knew this. I wasn't going to let her fade away again. Not now, not ever. The next few weeks were quiet, not silent, the kind of quiet that feels full, not empty. I started waking up without dread in my chest. I'd brew my coffee, open the curtains, and let the morning sun pour in. At first, it all felt unfamiliar, almost foreign, but slowly, it started to feel like mine. One day, I sat down with one of those old journals again, not just to read this time, but to write. My hand trembled as I held the pen. I hadn't written anything in years, George said journaling was self-indulgent. He called it navel-gazing. But I used to love it. It helped me make sense of the world, of myself. I wrote one line, then another, then pages poured out, memories, thoughts, questions. I wrote about the time George made me throw out my favorite blue dress because he said it made me look desperate. I wrote about the time he pretended to forget my birthday, then got angry when I cried. I wrote about the way I learned to hold my breath when I heard his car pull into the driveway. I didn't realize how much I'd held inside until I let it out, and once I started, I couldn't stop. Each word on the page felt like a key turning in an old, rusted lock. That same week, I received a letter in the mail. Handwritten. No return address. But I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was from my sister, Carol. We hadn't spoken in nearly 15 years. George didn't like her, said she was too opinionated, too bossy. He used to take my phone after holidays, check my call logs, ask who I was talking to. Eventually, I just stopped calling people altogether. It was easier. But here it was, a letter from her. Inside, it said, "Maggie, I don't know if this will reach you. I heard about George from an old neighbor. I hope you're okay. I hope you're safe. I've missed you every single day. If you want to talk, I'm still here. No pressure. Just love. Carol." I sat there, holding the paper to my chest, sobbing, because even after all those years, someone had waited for me. Someone hadn't given up. I wrote back that very night. It felt strange, trying to explain so much in one letter, but I didn't try to wrap it in excuses or apologies. I just told the truth. I told her I was scared all the time, that I had forgotten how to be a sister, or even a friend, that I was trying, really trying, to learn again. I mailed it the next morning, hands shaking as I dropped it into the blue mailbox on the corner. A week later, she called. Hearing her voice broke something open in me. We talked for hours, we cried, we laughed, we remembered who we used to be before life pulled us apart, and she didn't ask for explanations. She just listened. That phone call became the first of many. I started reaching out to others too, old friends, neighbors I used to smile at from the porch but never spoke to, and slowly, bit by bit, the world began to widen again. I even joined a book club at the local library. The first time I walked into that room of strangers, I wanted to turn around and run, but I didn't. I sat down, listened, and eventually, I spoke. "I'm Margaret," I said, "and I'm just happy to be here." And I meant it. The more I stepped out into the world, the more I realized how much I'd been missing. Small things, simple things, the way people waved to each other across parking lots, the sound of shoes squeaking on the floors of the grocery store, the taste of strawberries in spring. How had I forgotten how sweet they were? But the hardest part wasn't what I had forgotten. It was what I had to learn again. One afternoon, I was in line at the pharmacy when the man behind me accidentally bumped into my shoulder. I flinched so hard I dropped my wallet. He apologized, but I couldn't respond. My heart was racing, my palms sweating. It was just a touch, accidental, harmless, but I couldn't breathe right for minutes. That night, I sat on my couch, wrapped in a blanket, and tried to understand it. Why was I still so afraid? Why was my body still reacting like he was in the room? I called my counselor, Elaine, the one I'd met through the local women's center. She answered immediately, like she knew I needed her. "Margaret," she said gently, "your body isn't broken. It's just been on high alert for a very long time." She told me something I hadn't considered before, that healing doesn't always feel good. Sometimes healing feels like fear, or grief, or even rage, because you're finally letting yourself feel what you had to push down just to survive. It made sense. It didn't make it easier, but it made sense. That week I bought a small notebook and titled it, "Things That Make Me Feel Safe." At first the list was short. Hot tea, locked doors, my sister's voice on the phone, the smell of clean laundry. Then it grew. Sunlight on my face, saying no and not explaining, crying without apologizing, laughing loudly at my own joke. I started writing something in that notebook every day. Not just what made me feel safe, but what made me feel real. I began to notice moments when I didn't flinch, like when a stranger held the door open for me and I said thank you without my voice shaking, or when I asked a question in book club without rehearsing it 3 times in my head. One evening, Carol came to visit. It was the first time someone had stayed the night in my apartment. She brought soup and old photo albums. We sat on my little couch, flipping through pictures from decades ago, back when I wore overalls and had bangs cut too short. We laughed until we cried. At one point, she looked at me and said, "You seem brighter." Brighter. It was such a simple word, but it landed in me like a gift. I didn't tell her that I still sometimes slept with the hallway light on. I didn't tell her that I still checked the lock 3 times before bed. I just smiled and said, "Thank you." Because she was right. I was brighter. Not healed completely. Not fearless. But brighter. That night, I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea, watching the stars come out. I thought about the version of me who used to sit in silence, watching the clock tick down the minutes until George got home, trying to disappear into the wallpaper. She was still with me, in a way. A shadow, maybe. But now, I could hold her hand and whisper, "It's okay. We made it out." And sometimes, I even believed it. There was a moment, about 6 months after George's funeral, when I realized something odd. I hadn't thought about him all day, not once. Not when I made my coffee, not when I walked to the bookstore, not even when I passed the park bench where we used to sit in silence, each pretending the other wasn't breaking. That night, I sat with that realization like it was something fragile. I didn't feel guilty, just surprised. Like I'd taken off a coat I didn't know I was still wearing. And underneath it, I was lighter. I spent more time at the bookstore now, both as a customer and a volunteer. It became my safe haven. There was a little corner table near the back where I'd sip tea and read for hours. Sometimes I helped restock shelves, recommend novels to other women, or organize the weekly discussion group. We didn't just talk about books in those meetings, we talked about life, loss, reinvention. There was something sacred about sitting with other women and saying the truth out loud, even when it hurt. One afternoon, a woman named Joanne, around my age, shared that she'd just left a 30-year marriage. She was trembling as she spoke, voice thin but steady. "I don't even know who I am without him," she said. I looked at her, and before I could stop myself, I said, "That's exactly how I felt, but that's where it starts." She blinked at me. "Where what starts?" "Becoming someone new." The group was quiet for a moment. Then someone else whispered, "Amen." Afterward, Joanne came up to me. "Do you really believe that?" she asked. "I do," I said, "even if some days I forget." Because I did forget sometimes. Healing isn't a staircase, it's a spiral. I'd go weeks feeling strong, then wake up one morning with a heavy heart and no idea why. But now I had tools, I had people, I had words for what I was going through. I even started writing letters to George. I never sent them, of course. I just kept them in a drawer. They weren't angry. They were honest. Letters like, "Dear George, you said I was lucky to have you, but I think the real luck came after you were gone. Not because you died, but because I finally got to live." And sometimes, "Dear George, I hope, wherever you are, you understand what you did to me. And I hope you know I forgive you. But I will never forget." Those letters helped me say the things I never could in person. They also reminded me that I still had a voice, and I could use it for myself now. One Saturday morning, I passed a mirror in the bookstore and barely recognized myself. Not because I looked different, though I did. My hair was a little longer, my eyes a little brighter, but it was the way I stood, shoulders back, chin up, like I belonged. It made me stop, made me look closer. "Hello," I whispered to my reflection. "There you are." And for the first time in decades, I said my full name out loud, not as someone's wife or someone's mistake or someone's secret. "My name is Margaret Elaine Winters. I am 66 years old, and I am not afraid of who I am becoming." It's funny how the smallest things can feel like victories when you've survived a life like mine. Last week I hung a painting in my living room, one I picked out myself at a local market. Just a quiet seascape, soft blues and grays. But when I look at it, it feels like peace. Like choosing something for no one but me. I've started volunteering once a week at a women's shelter downtown, the same kind of place that took me in when I had nowhere to go. The women there are younger, mostly, but their eyes carry the same storms. Some of them can't speak yet, others can't stop. I listen either way. Sometimes that's all someone needs, to be heard without being fixed. There's one girl, maybe 19, who reminds me so much of myself it hurts. She sits in the back, arms folded tight, like if she loosens up even for a second, she'll fall apart. Last week she asked me why I come back if I'm okay now. I smiled and told her, because healing is a road, not a destination, and because no one should walk it alone. That night I went home and wrote in my journal again. I don't write every day, but I do when the feelings get heavy or bright or just too big to hold. I wrote, "There's a version of me that still flinches at sudden noises, still wakes up reaching for a light switch, but there's also a version of me that dances while making coffee, who sings with the radio, who laughs too loud at terrible jokes. I contain all of her now. I am not just the woman who was left behind, I am the woman who came back." I've begun making plans, not grand ones, just little seeds of future, a trip to the coast, a garden to plant in the spring, a letter to send to my estranged sister. I don't even know if she'll write back, but I'm not afraid to reach out anymore. Fear ruled my life for so long. It disguised itself as love, as duty, as silence. But now, when fear knocks, I don't answer the door. I sit still, I breathe. I remind myself, you are here, you are whole, you are free. Sometimes people ask me if I ever wish things had been different, if I resent the years I lost, and the honest answer is, yes, sometimes I do. I grieve for the time stolen from me, for the joys I didn't get to live, but I also honor the woman who survived it all, the one who held on long enough to become who I am now. So, if you're listening to this, and you're still inside your own storm, please hold on. The sky does open eventually. And when it does, the light that comes in will be the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. My name is Margaret. I am 66 years old, and for the first time in my life, I finally feel like I'm home.